Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar on participatory approaches to environmental decision making. Your moderators for today will be Horst Monken-Fernandes from the International Atomic Energy Agency and myself, I'm Caterina Turcanu from the Belgian Nuclear Research Center. So Horst, I let you do the introduction and also introduce the first speaker and his welcome word to this webinar.
Okay, thank you, Caterina. Can you hear me? Good. So, dear participant of the panel, participatory approaches to environmental remediation decision-making. As Caterina indicated, my name is Horst Monken-Fernandes, and I'm an environmental remediation specialist at the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, together with Caterina, a distinguished researcher at the Belgian Nuclear Research Center. We would like to welcome you to this event organized under the auspices of the RICOMET2021 conference as a joint effort of the EnviroNet, the IAEA Network on Environmental Remediation and Norm Management, the SCK CEN, the Belgian Nuclear Research Center, the European Norm Association, and the SHARE platform, Social Sciences and Humanities in Ionizing Radiation. Just as an initial considerations, we all know that decision-making is complex situations has proven to be a great challenge. So generally speaking, contemplating objective factors and those of more subjective nature is quite difficult, especially when a multitude of actors or stakeholders, as you wish, are involved, having different levels of understanding and perception over the situation in question, but also distinct interests. As the world is seeing now with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, and also true for environmental remediation, those who seek to provide an honest and accurate account of the state of the science must also be cognizant of how such accounts are received. In addressing issues at the nexus of science and public policy, presenting a variety of responsible views where consensus does not exist is a challenge. And I believe you agree with me that it's not all about science. The truth is that economic aspects, social and political dimensions will also play a decisive role in the decision-making in complex situations. Therefore, the objective of this panel is to bring together different perspectives that influence the decision-making in the scope of environmental remediation under the views and experience of a set of knowledgeable and distinguished professionals. They will provide their views on the topic, but the key to the success of this panel is the participation of the attendees that can place questions to be addressed by the panelists. We do expect an intense participation and as a result collect insights that can contribute to the work we are all doing in this area. So without further ado, I give back the floor to Dr. Caterina that will take over for now. Caterina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Horst. I think you touched on all the important aspects that we wish to address. Some key questions are how are societal demands for transparency and participation in decision processes being put into practice? How are institutions integrating insights from non-governmental actors and citizens? What are the challenges and opportunities? Approaches are indeed needed to integrate insights from a variety of disciplines and a wide range of stakeholders. The important issue is how to consider all these elements and provide for a decision-making process that produces technically and economically feasible, but also socially responsive and sustainable environmental remediation. I would like to remind you that the webinar is recorded and you can use the Q&A and the chat function to pose your questions all throughout the webinar. We will first start with an intervention from each of our distinguished panelists. We will accept one or two questions after each presentation. Afterwards, we have more room for discussions on the topics that are highlighted. Horst, would you like to introduce Christophe Xerri, our first speaker?
Yes, Christophe Xerri is currently the director of the NEFW division at the IAEA Nuclear Energy Department. So we can go for his intervention.
Bonjour à tous. It is a real pleasure for me to be here today, even if I may not be completely here, and to contribute to this event on participatory approaches to environmental remediation decision making. And I really wish to thank the organizers, and in particular SCK CEN and the Environment Professional Network of the agency to have put this event together. A small word on the International Atomic Energy Agency. We have been created in 1957. Our motto is Atom for Peace and Development. I think we are recognized as a reference body when it comes to nuclear and atomic related matters, and we are also recognized for our neutrality. With 172 member states, we have also a broad reach of member states. So as you can see, we are a technical body, but it doesn't mean that we have no interest in things which are not only hard science. One of our roles is connect people, connect member states, connect networks. Environet is one example of this network of professionals, but more globally, our role is to catalyzing our members and our member states for them to grow and share together. And that brings really a good bridge, if I can say so, with the topics that we are addressing today. Because decision-making is also connecting people and integrating all dimensions from technical to economical to political and social aspects. And it's particularly true in environmental remediation. There may be the temptation of engineers to say science is there and it's done. On the other hand, there may be the temptation of political sciences to say everything is about discussion and everything else will follow and is secondary. But I think the real world is much more complex than that. And it's important to bridge in any decision making and in any process of decision making, technical, economics, political, and social aspects. And that's the other way of bridging, and not only bridging these different expertise, but also bridging between the one who are practitioners who have to take decisions and to make decisions in the ground, and the one who are more conceptualizing these topics, whether it is from a social scientist point of view or whether it is from a technical point of view. And bridging also between the research and concept and the challenges of really taking decision is also something that I believe is very important and shall be discussed today. As I mentioned previously, the IAEA is primarily a technical body, and not a social science is not a science, but it's not a type of technological and scientific things in which the agency has been created for. That being said, as I also mentioned, it's important that all dimensions are taken into account when we're talking about decision making, and it's part of the role of the agency to raise awareness and to connect people in all those different fields. The only thing which is important is to be humble, to recognize what we can do and what we cannot do. And especially when we're talking about stakeholders engagement or decision making, it's not something like 1 + 1 = 2, and the context and situation of the topic, of the country, of the time makes a very strong impact on the process which can be followed. In this respect, because our role is to be neutral and to provide support to all member states regardless of their specificities, one of the things we wish to work is on methodologies. And I think within the Environet Professional Network and the different topics discussed, one of them is methodologies and processes for decision making. The other thing that we are happy to do is to facilitate exchange of experience. Again, we all need to be very humble and very cautious. There is no real good practice in terms of how to do things, apart from applying a methodology, because again, what could work in Canada today for a specific project may not work in Tajikistan, and on the other hand, something which is working in Tajikistan may not work in Japan. So it's important that exchange of experience takes place, and it's part of our role and also part of this meeting to facilitate this exchange of experience as an inspiration, but not as a copy-paste. I am therefore particularly encouraged with the setup of this meeting, with the participation of many experts, many views from different places, different domains, different approaches, so that this meeting will be fruitful, stimulating, and inspiring, connecting experts, connecting knowledge, and connected people. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Xerri could not be here with us in person, but we would like to thank him very much for this intervention. I think it clearly showed the IAEA's support for multidisciplinarity and multi-actor involvement in decision-making. Since we don't have Dr. Xerri here, but Horst is nevertheless from the International Atomic Energy Agency, I'd like to ask him a small question. Horst, you have experience for many years of collaborating with social scientists. What is, you think, one of the one of the things that you have learned that you treasure and you think, oh, this is something that was a real added value for you personally from this collaboration? You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. We start collaborating more closely with the social scientists since the first edition of RICOMET. And since then, we have been incorporating more and more all the knowledge and the lessons learned that we have been shared and start working together to the point that social sciences in different dimensions has been incorporated in our activities. And I guess that one expression of that collaboration is the project that we have launched some years ago, the Maestri project, in which the different elements of social science is a key element of the project that you are also the chair. And as Christophe just mentioned, there is a need to approach these communities to incorporate and pretty much get away from that ambition that might exist that we can handle all the issues in terms of the technical perspective alone. But it's absolutely important that integrated the social ethical dimensions in the things we do. And I think that this collaboration today, for example, is a good example of this interaction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will go now to our next speaker, Stéphane Pepin, from the Federal Agency for Nuclear Control, which is the Belgian radiation safety regulator. He's a physicist and has been involved in regulatory supervision of various environmental remediation projects dealing with naturally occurring radioactive material. He participated in the development of national regulations regarding remediation of areas contaminated with radioactive substances, and is also a board member of the European Norm Association. So Stéphane will present the point of view of the regulator in what concerns participation in decision-making. Please, Stéphane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for this nice introductions and for inviting me in presenting the point of view of a regulator on this interesting debate. Just to check if you see my screen.
Yes, it's all good.
My slides?
You can put it in presentation mode if you like.
Yes, now it's done now. So I will share with you a few reflections. I will not give a complete picture of what are the responsibilities of a regulator in the decision-making process regarding environmental remediation. But I first to share with you some reflections about the need to justify. The need to justify your decision. So we are here talking about decision making. If you make decisions, you need to take decisions on a sound basis. So there is always the question. I think it is the question which is at the core of the discussion here. It is a question of justifications of your decision, of your strategy. People from ICRP would be able to explain this much better than me, but you know probably that a contaminated site is what we call in the terminology of radiation protection an existing exposure situation. Contaminated site is there. It's not a new activity that you are starting, that you want to develop. It is an exposure situation. It is a situation which can lead to exposure of people, an exposure situations that already exist, which is there when a decision on control of the situations has to be taken.
Stéphane, if I may interrupt you just for a second to let you know that we only see your first slide, so maybe you want to put it in a slide show mode.
Normally, so you don't see the
no, we only
moving.
See the first slide. Just like in PowerPoint, you normally do put it under slideshow. There is a button on the top.
Yeah, it was on slideshow on my screen, but let me see how I can.
Okay, now we can see your second slide. So if you click on the left side, we also can see.
Is it okay like this?
Yes, yes, now it's, yes, thank you.
So I was talking about the fact that contaminated sites are considered from radiation protection's point of view as an existing exposure situations. These are exposure situations that already exist when a decisions on control has to be taken. So your position as a regulator is quite different from the position you have with respect to a new activity. If someone comes to you to ask for authorizations to, I don't know, to build a new research reactor, to use a radioactive source in its factory, then you need to ask to this person, well, do you really need this radioactive source? Do you really need to build a new reactor or something like this? Here, well, the source is already there. It's contaminated site somewhere, and in fact, what you need to justify is what you do with this site. Do you need, yes or no, to remediate this site? And if you decide to remediate this site, what is the best option to control the risk, if there is a risk, with respect to this site? So if you look at the ICRP recommendations 103, there is a definition of the concept of justification in the context of existing exposure situation. It is a process of determining whether a proposed remedial action is likely overall to be beneficial. So whether the benefits to individual and to society, including reduction in exposure from introducing or continuing the remedial action, outweigh its cost and any harm or damage it causes. So you need really to justify the remedial action, the protection strategy. So the basic principle is actually common sense. It's just that the remedial actions should do more good than harm. If you look at IAEA basic safety standards, GSR Part 3, you have a similar concept. It's requirement 48, saying that the government and the regulatory body or other relevant authorities shall ensure that remedial actions and protective actions are justified and that protections and safety is optimized. So you have two aspects. You need to justify what you do, and you need to act in such a way that you optimize protection. Okay, these are nice words, but how to implement this principle in practice? We will see that it's not so easy. It's easy to say, but it's not so easy to do. Going to the next slide, but I'm not sure that can you see my next slide?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Oh, okay, so it works now. Well, first, I come back to this sentence from the IAEA Basic Safety Standard. So the relevant authority shall ensure that remedial actions are justified. There is already a catch in this sentence. I mean, the relevant authority. In fact, there is no such thing as one regulator, especially when you are dealing with contaminated sites. Contaminated sites encompass many different aspects. You have, of course, the aspect of radioactive contamination, but often, I mean, in most cases, this radioactive contamination is mixed with other contaminants. Moreover, if you decide to remediate, you will generate waste, radioactive waste or non-radioactive waste. You have transportation issue, you have environmental impact of your remedial actions, you have, of course, cost. And because of all these factors connected to the remediations process, you don't have just one single relevant authority. You have, in fact, many different authorities which need to be involved in your process. So it's something you need to realize, and this is something which make the decision-making process in a remediation process quite complex. You need to implement this in practice. You need a multidisciplinary, multi-agency approach. Of course, you need to have a clear assessment of the risk, of the different risk, the risk related to radiation, to the public, to the workers who carry out the remediation activities, the risk related to conventional health and safety. You have many players in the decision making. That means that if you want things to go forward, you need to have a clear assignment of responsibilities in the decision making and of leadership. I mean, the issue of leadership is fundamental. If you have no leadership in the process, generally the process of remediations will get stuck. And actually, this issue of assignment of responsibilities and leadership is valid for the relations between different authorities, but it is also valid for the relations within a single authority, within the different, I don't know, departments of a regulatory body, between the expert within the regulatory body and the management of the regulatory body. So you have all these, how can I say, all these different clusters of decision within the whole framework of your decision-making process, which needs to fit together. And what you want to avoid absolutely is this kind of catch-22 situations, which in fact occurs quite frequently in remediation process. I mean, it is illustrated by the drawing here, where someone say, yeah, I cannot decide on remediations because I have no option or I have no policy for the management of the remediation waste, and the people in charge of developing the policy for radioactive waste say, well, sorry, but I cannot develop a waste management policy because you didn't decide about remediations of contaminated sites. And people are just pointing finger to each other, and things don't move forward. So this is the kind of situations you you want to avoid, but unfortunately, which sometimes happens in reality. You have many regulatory bodies involved in a remediations process or in a remediation decision-making process. And this reflects the fact that you have many factors impacting the decision. I prefer not to enter into too many abstract considerations, but I would just like to illustrate a few of these factors on basis of a concrete example of a remediation process that we experienced in Belgium recently. In Belgium, we have a series of, not like any other countries, we have a series of contaminated sites, essentially due to past or to recent norm activities, or activities, industrial activities involving naturally occurring radioactive materials. In particular, we had to remediate recently a river which was contaminated by the past liquid discharges of a phosphate fertilizers plant. In fact, the radiation protections aspects in this project were present, so you cannot deny them, but they were not the driving force of the contaminations. As I mentioned, especially in the context of naturally occurring radioactive material, you don't deal with acute radiation protections risk. You have more risk from, I would say, the non-radioactive contaminants, heavy metals, and these kind of things. So the remediations process in that case was essentially driven by the environmental authorities. The environmental authorities acknowledged the fact that there was also a radioactive component in the contamination, and there was a collaboration agreement between the different authorities involved. So the environmental authorities, the local authorities, the municipalities, and FANC, the radiation protection authorities. I mentioned leadership. In that case, the leadership was clearly by the environmental authorities, and the responsibility of the operator was around waste management. Multidisciplinary approach was implemented. You had to consider river modeling, dispersions modeling, groundwater modeling. So you have all these different disciplines of expertise which need to meet each other. And we set up. I mean, my colleagues of the environmental authority set up a multi-agency steering group to address the different aspects. The bottleneck principle was applied in the choice of the remediation scenario on basis of a multi-criteria analysis. What were the factors in the multi-criteria analysis? Of course, the risk, the degree of contamination, both for radiation and for non-radioactive contaminants, but also economical factors, practical and ecological factors. Ecological factors, for instance, I mean, we had to take into account in the remediations of this river that in fact there were many, several protected species of biota living or growing on the banks of this contaminated river. So, of course, if you start remediations works and excavating soil, you will destroy all this biota. So it's something you need to take into account. So, in fact, one of the decisions was, in fact, not to remediate on the parts of the river where you had protected biota species. So in fact, to protect the environment, we decided not to remediate some parts of this river. There are also just purely practical considerations. There are places where, well, simply you cannot access with trucks. I mean, these are marshlands, so big machine, bulldozer trucks, they will just, I mean, be stuck in the mud if you send machines there. So you cannot remediate just because of very practical, pragmatic considerations. And of course, you need to take into account the quantity of waste which will be generated by remediation activities. Even if we didn't remediate everywhere, still the remediation activities generated something like 90,000 cubic meter of contaminated material. You need to dispose of this contaminated material somewhere without creating a new legacy somewhere else. You need to transport all these 90,000 cubic meter. 90,000 cubic meter, it's something like 5,000 trucks. You don't decide about sending 5,000 trucks on the road without thinking about it. So you need to take into account all these different factors carefully in your decision. To conclude, I will just say that it's possible to be successful in remediations projects and to take into account point of view of different parties. But I think for this, what you really need is, I would say, humility. It's maybe a kind of religious word, but sometimes, especially in the radiations protection field, sometimes people think that when radioactivity is something special. Radioactivity is not something special. Radioactivity is one of the factors that you need to take into account, but it's not. You don't need necessarily to deal with it in a different way than other factors.
Okay, Stéphane, we need to round it up.
Yeah, sorry.
Of time. Sorry.
But that's basically my final word.
Yeah, I think your message is very important. You talk about dialogue. Just a very short question for you, and if you like to elaborate further later on, you are welcome. Véronique Leroyer is asking you, how do you involve civil society actors in remediation decision making?
No, it depends, of course, on the extent of the remediations. But normally, when you develop such remediations projects, you organize information session for the inhabitants. You have also normally what we call an inquiry when you, I mean, decisions on remediations, it's like a license. You have public inquiries about well, the options, the remediations options that you will propose, and the public may send their concern or their remarks through this public inquiry process.
Okay, thank you for now. We will come back to that maybe in the common discussion. I propose to go to the next speaker. Horst, would you like to introduce Christine? Or?
Yes, Katrina. So just to recap a little bit, we had Christophe giving the perspective of the international organization, Stéphane Pepin giving the perspective of the regulatory body. Now we have Christine Gallis that will cover the perspective of an implementer, the engagement with different stakeholders and politicians in appropriation of resources. So Christine has decades of experience in the planning and implementation of complex environmental management programs. She had something like 23 years career with the US Department of Energy Environmental Management Program, leading radioactive waste management policy and strategies. For more than a decade, she has supported IAEA projects and networks and currently serves as the senior advisor to the IAEA network of environmental management and remediation, EnviroNet. Today, she is the Senior Vice President for Operations for Longenecker and Associates, a small business providing technical support and expertise to nuclear programs and sites in the United States. We had the pleasure to have Christine Gallis with us. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome to everybody. What a diverse and global participation is being recorded in the chat. So thank you for letting us know who you are and that you're with us. I'm going to stop my video just because I have an unstable internet with a storm behind me. So my apologies, and thank you, Katrinelle, for showing my slides. As Horst explained, I'm here to provide a view of the implementer based on 20 years of working with the US Department of Energy's Environmental Management Program. My goal is to provide you a quick overview of that program, its scope, and the program's progress at a very summary level, and then spend a little bit of time talking about the diversity of its stakeholder framework. And then I'll highlight several examples, case studies of its advances and its successes in engaging a wide range of stakeholders in its environmental decision-making. And I do hope that, as Christophe said, that you'll find these examples inspiring. They differ by site, and that's one of the fundamental points, is that each cleanup site requires a bit of a unique approach to tailored approach to how you engage your stakeholders, given the circumstances of the projects and the realities of the perspectives of the community of stakeholders surrounding that specific site. Next slide, please. Okay. No, Katrinelle, if you've advanced, there we are. Thank you. So this is a very summary representation of the Department of Energy's Environmental Management Program. It was formed in 1989, a little more than 3 decades ago, to clean up 107 sites across the United States. And great progress has been made in terms of the number of sites. So 91 sites have been completed, and there's active cleanup work at 16 remaining sites. And while a large number of sites have been completed, those in relative terms were much simpler than those that remain. So there's quite a lot of several decades of continuous work remaining. There are significant volumes of radioactive waste, surplus nuclear materials, including used nuclear fuels, and then vast acreage of contaminated facility soil and groundwater. Each year, the Department of Energy identifies their near-term goals. So this is a snapshot of their current year mission and priorities. And you can see this at this website, and you can take a look and see more detail. And there's a wonderful YouTube history. It's about 8 minutes long to see the history of the Environmental Management Program. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are some very diverse stakeholders involved throughout this complex, but EM has always worked to actively engage that wide range of stakeholders. And I need that term very inclusively. This statement is right off of their engagement website. Public input helps the agency make better decisions that are cost effective, community specific, and environmentally sound, and that leads to faster and safer cleanups. We have external regulators at both the state and the federal level. There are site-specific advisory boards that have been formed to advise the cleanup decisions. And there's a headquarters level board called the EM Advisory Board that advises the senior leadership in the program. There are a number of financial grants that are provided to intergovernmental groups to facilitate engagement of community organizations, as well as state legislatures, as well as tribal nations. And there is a federal law that requires public engagement. It's called the National Environmental Policy Act. A lot of information could be found about that on the US EPA page. And then, of course, there are public citizen groups that call for action, tend to be more critical of the department's activities. They're watchdog groups, but they're also an important element of the stakeholder population. Next slide, please. So our first case study, the Rocky Flats Closure Project. I'm sure a lot of you have heard much about this. It was an innovative initiative, the first pilot closure site. It was a former weapons plant. A negotiated multi-party cleanup agreement called the Rocky Flats Cleanup Agreement was developed to guide the cleanup, and it actually required the formation of a stakeholder focus group that was active throughout the cleanup and had a very active voice in the decision making. The cleanup agreement also defined processes for detailed work plans to be reviewed and approved, both by commented on by the public and then reviewed and approved by the two regulatory agencies involved in the cleanup agreement. Congressional support was really key to the ability to accelerate the cleanup. And then the federal law was passed that established the end state. So this is an example of one of those catch-22 situations that Stéphane described, where it was difficult to set the cleanup standards for Rocky Flats without knowing what the future use would be. And it was difficult to set the future use without knowing what the cleanup standards were. So the federal law guiding a wildlife designation allowed for a lot more clarity around the specifics of the soil action levels to be established. Through the course of this project, DOE-EM came to realize that announce and defend was not a workable strategy. And so they moved to a very conscious commitment to openness and transparency. And around the site, there were a number of local community governments that formed a coalition so they could very effectively speak with one voice, rationalize and integrate their views as they engaged with DOE so that there was a more effective input and influence on the decisions that were made. Because Rocky Flats was a pilot closure site, there were many lessons learned and a very comprehensive legacy report was developed, and it's provided here. And there's a detailed chapter on stakeholder engagement, and that's the second link at the bottom of this page that I encourage you to take a look at. Next slide, please. Another closure project was the Fernandes closure project around the same time as Rocky Flats, running in parallel. It was a uranium processing facility. We had realized that the mandated public participation programs were not fully meeting the local citizen needs in Ohio near this site. And so DOE chose to adopt a more enhanced participation strategy to drive more two-way communication above and beyond what was required. So they had a series of workshops, roundtables, and very frequent site visits and tours. A Fernandes Citizens Task Force was formed, which later became the Site-Specific Advisory Board, and they had a very active voice in some of the fundamental cleanup decisions that I highlight in the final bullet here. An interesting thing about Fernandes is that they also chose to develop something called the Envoy program, where they designated technicians and engineers around a broad set of disciplines and community sources so that they would basically be the eyes and ears for the stakeholder groups, that they could get firsthand information and relay that back, and then be a really effective resource for the public to relay their concerns back. So they were liaisons, intermediaries basically between the department and the stakeholder organizations above and beyond these workshops and roundtables. The key outcomes of this participatory approach was that we were able to achieve alignment on the end state, which ended up being an environmental preserve, and then also agreement on the formation of an on-site disposal facility. So large volumes of waste could be disposed on-site, saving cost and time, allowing the cleanup to be completed sooner. But in exchange for agreeing for on-site disposal, there was an absolute commitment to remove some higher activity waste streams from the site and send them west to another off-site disposal facility. And here's a link to some details on the Fernandes Preserve as it exists today. Next slide, please. And I'll move as quickly through these as I possibly can. I won't read you every word. Other aspects of our regulatory partnering that has happened in the Department of Energy is we have formal partnering approaches with the regulators with a set of tiered teams. There are staff level tiers and then mid-level management and then very high level management so that there can be an elevation of disagreement around more technically complex issues. At the Savannah River site in South Carolina, a regulatory core team has worked for more than a decade and has developed very innovative permitting strategies to allow liquid tank waste from reprocessing of spent fuel, those tanks to be retrieved and permanently closed, and low activity portions of that waste to be stabilized and disposed on site, which was innovative. At Oak Ridge in Tennessee, where some groundwater remediation issues have been the subject of formal dispute and have caused delays to the cleanup program, an active partnering arrangement has been established to try and work through the differing views and come to an agreement on how we can move forward and resolve that dispute. At Nevada, which operates a disposal facility that takes waste from all around the country, there were some controversial waste streams that were causing concerns. And so a very high level working group was established at this governor's level with the Secretary of Energy to within lower level mediators at a mid-level management to negotiate around challenging waste streams and which would be acceptable. And that working group arrangement required certain public notice and additional public comment on certain shipping campaigns. And then, as Horst mentioned, the US Congress provides, serves an important role in such a complex cleanup program. And so they formed a bipartisan nuclear cleanup caucus, which chaired by two congressmen, and they get together multiple times each year to hold sessions, public hearings that promote the awareness of the US nuclear legacy and work to build a coalition across political lines so that the needs of the cleanup sites can be met. Next slide, please. Very importantly, when I use the term public, that does not encompass the Native American and Alaskan Native tribes and governments. They have a very special status, and for that reason, I wanted to give them their own slide. They are a very important element of the stakeholder framework, however, for the Department of Energy. And just a few things, and again, I won't read these. We've developed writers groups with the surrounding tribe at one site to allow them to develop in their own words how they view the environmental impacts of certain decisions, and those are in formal documents that are published. At another site in New Mexico, we provide financial assistance to the Pueblo Nation so that they can develop independent monitoring programs, take samples, split samples, environmental samples, and do their own analysis. So it raises their capacity to be a really meaningfully engaged stakeholder in the cleanup decisions. And then beyond those involvement programs, there's a formal requirement for government to government consultation, because these tribal communities are nations with sovereign rights unto their own. Because of the importance of these activities under the Department of Energy policy, each DOE site has a designated DOE official accountable for this. So that accountability to honor the rights of these Native American governments is very important. Next slide, please. And my final slide. So what I would love for you to take away from this is that the breadth and depth of the Department of Energy's environmental management program requires us to tailor our approaches to participatory engagement and decision-making, and that the stakeholder framework is large and complex. But I hope that there are a number of experiences that you will find inspiring, and hopefully the resources I've provided will be a source of additional information. My email is also on the cover of this slide, and I would welcome your outreach, and I'd be happy to connect you with the information. But I'm proud to say that DOE is very committed to transparent involvement and active participation in decision-making across this range of stakeholders. Over 30 years, their experience has evolved and they've gotten better at this, but I can tell you that the commitment is unwavering. There are best practices that we've identified, but of course the approaches have to be tailored by site. And with the recent election, the new leadership in the Department of Energy is placing very significant additional emphasis on environmental justice, which will ensure that those communities that are most impacted by the historic operations at these sites have a voice. And so I think that we'll see even more advances and progress in this important area. I've given you the link again to the environmental management program, as well as the link to the legacy management program, which is the organization within DOE that takes care of sites after they've been fully remediated and closed or in a long-term stewardship status. So there's a lot of historical documents, including those on participatory approaches to stakeholder engagement that are available at those resources. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Christine, for this really comprehensive presentation with rich examples. I think there is a lot to learn from these experiences, and many institutions could follow this example. You had two questions. Maybe we can answer shortly and then come back later on. So one of the questions was, what if in stakeholder participatory activities there is no consensus, for instance, with civil society organizations or non-governmental organizations? How then are decisions being taken? And the second was, are stakeholders involved also in techno-scientific issues, for instance, discussing exposure scenarios or risk estimations?
Thank you. I'll answer both of those as quickly as I can. So for the first one, on what if there's not a consensus? So the United States has, with the help of its regulators, the US EPA and the states, a very well-defined set of cleanup standards and performance objectives that have to be met. And so if there is not consensus around a decision, ultimately DOE has the authority as the responsible owner and implementer to implement what is regulatorily compliant. Now, in the case of most of the remaining sites where there's a multi-party regulatory agreement, that cleanup decision is also going to be fully approved by those other regulatory agencies. So it is not that uncommon that the regulators and DOE reach an agreement that is unpopular with a stakeholder element. And that's unfortunate. We do our best, though, to always make sure they have the understanding of what goes into that decision and full appreciation that it is a compliant and technically defensible decision. But to the extent that consensus can be reached to arrange at a cleanup decision that is both compliant and satisfies everybody's expectation, that's the ideal, but not always achievable. And then the question on whether there are situations where where stakeholders involved in a more technical discussion, yes. So at Rocky Flats, for example, there was a special working group established to discuss exposure scenarios around the remaining radioactivity in the soil that would be left in that wildlife preserve. And that soil action working group worked for, I think, about 18 months, evaluating models of different cleanup standards, and ultimately made a recommendation that through the regulatory process of the cleanup agreement was implemented. So that's just one example. It takes time, it takes education, it takes explanation of models to make them understandable to the layperson, and continuous collaboration. A similar example would be that Fernandes Citizens Task Force with their engagement around the modeling associated with waste streams staying on site for disposal versus going off site to the west. Thank you for those questions.
Thank you very much, Christine. So we'll go forward to our next speaker, Abel González. Would you like to introduce him first?
Yep. Thank you, Catronel. So Abel would contemplate the aspects related to scientific evidence in the process of decision-making regarding environmental remediation. Abel is an Argentinian academician at the Nuclear Regulatory Authority of Argentina. He's also a member of the United Nations Scientific Committee for the Study of the Effects of Atomic Radiation, the Safety Standards Commission of the IAEA, and of several committees of the Nuclear Energy Agency of OECD, including its Committee on Radiation Protection and Public Health. He has been Director of Radiation Safety at the IAEA, Vice Chair of the ICRP, and Vice President of the IRPA, and President of its first IRPA Congress. So Abel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity, RICOMET. Thank you for the opportunity to be in touch with so many friends. I mean, more than 100 people around the world. Therefore, it's a really big audience. And well, let me share my. Yeah, I will address really three issues.
Excuse me, we are not seeing yet your screen. Maybe you have to select full.
Well, I thought that was, let me see. You can see it now? No.
Not yet, no.
Well, this was working before. I know why it's not working now.
So when you press share, you have to select the whole screen. There is another small window where you have to select.
Well, I'm sorry for this. Now you can see it?
No, not yet, Bill.
Well, it's not see it, my goodness. I'm sorry. It was working before. I don't know why it's not working now. I don't know what to do, really. Let me see.
Did you select whole screen? Because if you select just a window, we will not see it.
Yes, I did it. But I'm sorry.
Shall we maybe go to the next presentation, or?
Well, if not, I can say it without the presentation what I was going to say.
You can also send it to me now if it's not.
Let me see if now it's working. Now it's
Yes,
working?
yes, perfect. Thank you very much.
I apologize for this loss of time. Well, I was going to address 3 issues. We have problems with remediation, and we have problems because the scientific bases are not understood clearly. We have problems because we have no social licensing, and this is linked to the first one. And we have problems because the regulatory scope is not clear at all. Let's start with the scientific basis. The first problem, the scientific bases are given by UNSCEAR. And UNSCEAR make a clear distinction between factual health effects and conjectures, but this is not always recognized by us and by the people. And it's important to respect UNSCEAR because UNSCEAR is part of the General Assembly, the only scientific committee of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and 190 countries give the blessing of the UNSCEAR result, but not always the result of UNSCEAR are respected. The Environmental Program of the United Nations make a summary of the thousands and thousands of pages of UNSCEAR in one graph. This is difficult, I mean, to put in one graph everything, in which probability of effect versus those without numbers saying very low, low, moderate, high, those are described in a very simple fashion. But in this graph, there are 3 things that are important I will mention. UNSCEAR clearly said that in high doses, we have clinically observable effect in individuals. In the medium doses, we have a statistically observable effect in populations, not on individuals. And in low doses, we have a biologically plausible occurrence of effect, but only biologically plausible. Therefore, what UNSCEAR is saying is that this graph can be divided in 2 areas, really. On the right, we have verifiable effects. And on the left, we have conjectures. And conjectures are important in physics, as we know, but conjectures are not facts, are conjectures. And this is clearly not clearly understood by people, even by scientists. They are not making this message clearly. This means that here on the right, we can attribute effects. And here on the left, we can just infer subjectively inference of risk depending on our subjective understanding of the conjectures that we are doing. Moreover, the attribution, as we know very well, is different in high doses, where the attribution can be individual, in medium doses, which is just collective, and in low doses, where there is just inference. Well, this simple scientific message is very important in remediation because more activities in remediation are work in this area, and people do not know that. That is a reality. The second issue is the social license. And we have problems with the social license, we know that. And one problem is that we don't understand each other. There is a serious problem of understanding between the scientific community and the people who should give the social license. There are many examples. I will just select one that probably is very indicative. My example will be the definition of risk. We use in our standards, the technical community, 3 different definitions of risk. One is a probability, the second is expectation value, completely different than the probability, and the third is a set of triplets, combining probabilities and effect. Well, this is among scientists. for every time that we use the word risk in one standard, mean different things. For if we have these problems among us, could you imagine the problem of normal people? Experts and society speak different languages, and risk is one example. People do not understand what we are saying because the connotation of risk for them is very different. It can mean probability, chance, plausibility, likelihood, prospect, hazard, in peril, in jeopardizing, gambling, robbing, venturing, danger, peril, threat, menace, fear, endangering. All these are connotation of risk for people. And what we know is that these people with scientific background, let's say, they understand more or less around that area, chance, plausibility. But the normal people, I mean, my own Maria at home, she understands peril, threat, menace, fear, and danger. Therefore, when we said that the remediation is of low risk, they don't understand. What do you mean when we said low danger? You tell me there is danger or no danger. There is a clear lack of understanding, and from there is coming the lack of social licensing that we have. And we have done very little effort. I have other examples which are even worse. The word contamination, you know. I mean, our statement, the contamination is low, is an absolute nonsense for normal people. They want to know whether there is contamination or not. It's like in your home, you know, you open talc powder, and then there will be talc all over your home. And you cannot say, you know, it's a little of talc. No, you want to clean it. The third issue, on which we have talked with Horst many times, is the issue of regulatory scope. Regulators in our area seem to understand that the scope of their work is infinite, something that do not happen in any other area. I mean, in the municipality of any city, they know that they regulate the car, the regulator regulate the cars, but they know that they don't regulate the bicycle. They don't put the plate to the bicycle. For every regulator, have clear what their scope is, not in our area. The regulators believe that their scope is absolutely infinite. And there are two things that the regulators really can do. Is one, to use the old proverb of the minimum not curat lex. Of course, this is not for regulators, really. This is for legislators. The legislators have been washing their hands here. But legislators shall pass legislation excluding some situations from regulations on the basis that control is deemed to be either unamenable or unjustified. You really can a regulator remediate Kerala, for instance? It's unamenable to remediate Kerala. You can understand that. And if you cannot remediate Kerala, why you remediate other areas where the residues are even lower than Kerala? Therefore, if this is agreeable, really the agency and other UN organizations should promote an international legislative consensus for excluding some remediation situation through legislation. This is not regulation. Don't give the ball to the regulator. Are the legislators who have to take care of this. And the second Roman proverb is the minimum not cura praetor. Praetor is the regulator in Rome. And here, yes, there is a problem of regulation, not legislation. Among the things that have to be regulated, you need quantitative provision for exemptions of remediations to be established by determining when protection is already optimized and therefore further regulation is unwarranted. And again, here we have very little, very little recommendation from the agency and other organizations which could establish unambiguously that the criteria for exemption of remediation is optimum protection equal no regulatory control. This is in summary things that can be done in these three areas, and these are not the only areas we know in which we have problems with remediation. But these three areas are particularly important. Our scientific understanding, our communication for getting social licensing, and that the regulators take the issue seriously and set clearly what their scope is and what is out of their scope. Thank you. Here you have my data, and please send me any letter or telephone or email if you need information supporting the 3 points that I have mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abel. If I may take the question, there was a question in the chat that somehow argue that it may be something like an overstatement that people do not understand risk. The idea is that people would be in the position to understand risk, but the key point, the key issue in the overall discussion is not essential, would not be, my interpretation of the question would not be essentially the risk, but it would be trust. How do you react to that?
Both things are correct. I mean, it's true that many people understand risk, but I believe that we should accept that if you ask people in the street what they mean by risk, frankly speaking, many people will give you different answers. And but for me, the more dramatic thing is that the more scientists, the answer is different. The more dramatic thing is that you take the current standards, the current international standard, you see there the word risk. You don't understand that they mean a probability, a mathematical expectation, or an esoteric number. It's not clear even in the standards, even among scientists. As you know very well, Horst, all the radiation protection community from the ICRP 60 on consider risk equivalent to a probability. But the nuclear safety community from Bierkhofer and the Rasmussen report on, they consider risk as a mathematical expectation of harm. And these are two completely different things. Probability is a number below 1. Mathematical expectation of harm can be any number, depending on the population that you include. For there are problems in the understanding of risk. The second point is trust, and that is correct. There is a lack of trust. And we should understand why there is a lack of trust. And misunderstanding is a particular point in this lack of trust. Look the word contamination. You know, the word contamination, which is wrong in English because contamination is coming from Latin contaminare and really means food that is not proper for religious purposes. Contamination is, for instance, kosher food in the Jewish and Arabic Islamic religion. This is, from there was the term contamination invented. For the term low contamination doesn't mean anything for people. And this was translated to other languages in a very, in that manner. In Japan, one of the big problems was that the contamination is translated as osen. Osen have two characters. One is dirtiness, very dirty, and the other one is tainted with dirt. How you can say to a Japanese, don't worry, the contamination is low? He cannot understand. I mean, he said, but tell me, you have to clean that, particularly in the Japanese society, you know, that are very, very polite. Therefore, the trust is an important issue, is, I believe, a relevant issue, but why this lack of trust is coming, I believe that we should make some reflection, I mean, the scientists, in the languages that we use, in the argument that we put, in the lack of scope that we have on our action. We believe that we have infinite scope, and we don't say that. This at the end became a lack of trust.
Well, if I may comment here, I think we clearly see here illustrated a gap between community of experts and also civil society, because there are decades of research in social sciences which show that people simply use broader considerations than only technoscientific facts to make their decisions. So, I mean, even if we all agreed on the technical issues, we might still decide to act in a different way depending on broader considerations.
This is correct. This is correct. There is an additional point that obviously I have no time to address. But if you like alpinism, you don't care that people tell you that the alpinism is risky. I mean, you go and do alpinism. And if you don't like alpinism, you will say this is very risky for me. These connections have to also be taken into account. The only problem that in our case people don't see any benefit of the situation that we are handling on. Therefore, we are going in the lower level of acceptability of risk. That is the problem.
Okay, let's move on to the next speaker. Thank you. The next speaker will be Azby Brown. Azby is an American living in Japan for 35 years, and he's author of many influential books and articles on Japanese architecture, design, and environmentalism. He retired from the faculty of Kanazawa Institute of Technology in 2016. Since the start of the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster in March 2011, Azby has been closely involved with assisting affected communities and reporting on the issues they face. He's lead researcher for SAFFECAST and is primary author of analysis published by the organization. He's involved in the group's day-to-day operations, including education and outreach to the expert community. So Azby expects from you to also maybe respond to some of the issues that Dr. González has put forward.
Yes, I hope to. And I want to express my thanks at inviting me to be here again at RICOMET. I think I've been representing SAFFECAST at RICOMET since the first one, 2015 or so. And it's been a great experience, and it's a great community to be part of and to share ideas. I'm not going to use any slides today. And I'll just talk about some issues that we see as rather important and growing in importance as our project continues. SAFFECAST, for those who don't know, began immediately after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in March 2011 in order to address the lack of, let's say, believable or trustworthy data from government and other official sources. And we began to crowdsource data and develop our own systems, hardware systems, software systems, internet systems, to collect and gather and share this data. And from these very, very small beginnings, we really delivered some very, very large results. It's, we think, the largest participatory citizen-based radiation monitoring program ever created. Our database currently has over 160 million data points and growing. And even during the coronavirus, pandemic, it's continued to grow. People are active all over. We also have a growing air quality program, which we've released some new low-cost network detectors called the AirNote recently. And I want to point out that a lot of our participation in Fukushima is about the before and after of remediation. A lot of our local volunteers, they present their own data to local government, for instance, to request attention to places that they think have been inadequately decontaminated, and they're gathering data and actually trying to present the data. And this brings with it some issues. And again, I also want to point out that, the project started small, but it grew. We began with Japan, but now we have data from over 100 countries around the world, a lot in Europe. A lot of countries are fairly densely covered with our volunteers' measurements. Some places are not yet, but it's growing. There's also a growing body of academic literature in both the social sciences as well as technical sciences, specifically examining the results of the SAFFECAST project and validating our approach and data. And also, of course, there's good faith criticism, which we engage with. We're always seeking to improve the project, and a lot of people come to us with issues that they think we should address. In March 2021 was the 10th anniversary of the Fukushima disaster and also of the start of SAFFECAST. And we organized a day-long event, a long webcast, a live stream that included about a 4-hour online roundtable with experts from many fields to evaluate the impact of SAFFECAST, to help set directions for the future, et cetera. And several people who are here today participated, and Katrina was a co-organizer. It was very, very gratifying. I want to point out that we began from a position of, let's say, great skepticism from government and many experts. There was sometimes some legal issues raised that may say that we could not continue this kind of work, and other issues of lack of transparency. And actually, there was some academic suppression in Japan at the time. But we noticed around the end of 2012 that we began to receive contact from bodies such as UNSCEAR, DARPA, We didn't solicit it. They contacted us. They wanted to know more about what we were doing, wanted to share ideas. And then we held workshops, for instance, in the US, where representatives of agencies like the NRA or DOE, NNSA, EPA, first responders from places like New York City and elsewhere, they joined the workshops and open dialogues. They wanted to learn about it, and we thought that the dialogues were very, very important for establishing mutual trust and an understanding of what we were doing and what they were trying to do. In February 2014, was IEM6, which was International Experts Meeting, Radiation Protection After the Fukushima Daiichi Accident, Promoting Confidence and Understanding. And that was a pivot point because we were invited to speak, and we were happy to be invited to speak. And I have to say, you know, it was a bit daunting, a bit intimidating to be in that room and to make our presentation. And the Q&A was a real hot seat, but I think we delivered, you know, satisfactory responses, and things started to change after that. And in the draft report from that meeting, I'll read from this. It was very, very supportive, we thought, and I'll quote, "As we have heard during this meeting, the right to know and the right to understand have evolved into the right to participate. The public is no longer prepared to sit idly by if their needs are not being met. They simply go out and organize things themselves. But crowdsourcing, for example, in the collection and dissemination of radiation data can also help instill confidence in information from official sources. But to continue to be effective, these public groups need to maintain their independence. To be seen to work too closely with the authorities will diminish their effectiveness and consequently also their credibility, making them redundant." And to conclude, for government authorities and agencies, crowdsourcing certainly is the genie that will not go back in the bottle. It is necessary to accept that this technology is here to stay and that empowerment of the public is not necessarily a negative development. So this both acknowledges the power and the potential of what SAFFECAST was doing, but also some of the concerns from the official bodies, from official agencies, IAEA itself, also the expert community. But overall, we consider this to be a really strong endorsement, and it signaled an opening to increased dialogue and led directly to us participating in RICOMET and many other things. And in the following years, we have been invited to many, to participate by many official agencies. We present our work, we conduct other joint activity. The IAEA in particular has invited us to attend meetings and workshops, both as a participant and instructor, on both social and technical issues such as designing and building low-cost sensor networks. And this has always been extremely productive and mutually beneficial. And again, RICOMET has led to very fruitful engagement. And partly on the strength of this and on share and engage, and maybe Catrinelle can correct me if I'm incorrect, there was language clearly supportive of citizen science included in recommendations made to the EC in 2019, I believe. And I think these recommendations have not yet been adopted, but it was clear, yes, we have to include citizen science groups in these activities. And I note that Christine in her presentation talked about a lot of actually legislated requirements for engagement and participation of local people and other stakeholders. And we think this is, of course, a very, very positive thing, and it should happen. And again, in IRC publication 146, which was released in draft in 2019 and published in 2020, it's radiological protection of people and the environment in the event of large nuclear accident. And it's an update of ICRP 109 and 111. There was a lot of stress on participation and citizens monitoring themselves, helping citizens learn to develop these capabilities, et cetera. A lot of discussion about the ethos project that was done in Fukushima, et cetera. So there was just a lot of support for this idea. But I mentioned earlier, we had our March 2021 10th anniversary roundtable, and we hope to obtain participation of some people from IAEA. And then we realized that the IAEA has not yet established an official position regarding citizen science activity, and whether it would be an endorsement or recommendations or advisory guidelines. And we think this is an appropriate and necessary step. Again, you know, we're happy to participate and be invited, and that's a very, very good thing. But then we also realize, and I can give an example in a moment, it's necessary, we think, for the IAEA to say, yes, this is something that's positive and it should happen. And we hope that we can begin some kind of substantive discussions on this and to move forward towards official inclusion of qualified citizen science organizations and relevant aspects of nuclear disaster response and communication. Of course, this includes monitoring of remediation, because as I mentioned, a lot of our volunteers in Fukushima, that's exactly what they're doing, but also decommissioning and education and social engagement in general. And I will point out in terms of an example, we have a project to place real-time sensors inside the exclusionary zone and elsewhere in Fukushima. And on my background, if you see here, these little dots, these are our real-time sensor network in Fukushima. We have over, I think, 23 emplacements presently, and 3 of them are within the exclusionary zone. And when we wanted to begin this, it was kind of difficult because we were only able to do it because of one Fukushima prefecture official who simply stamped the documents and said, this should happen, it's important, let's do it. Because he pointed out there's no existing process for accepting requests for placing an independent monitoring device on public property in this exclusion zone. There's no prohibition, no explicit prohibition, but also no guidelines for inclusion. And one reason is that there's no specific guidelines from the IAEA. So the Japanese government doesn't feel obliged to anticipate or accommodate these kinds of requests. So anyway, I want to point out that a lot of what we do is about participation. In fact, that's everything we do. It's all about participation, getting as many people comfortable and informed about monitoring radiation or monitoring air quality, for instance, getting them involved in these processes, helping them understand things like risk. We also consider it to be a sort of trust generation process, because as our data increased in quantity, and as the Japanese government, for instance, increased in quantity, people could compare and actually see, well, there doesn't appear to be anything really being hidden. Nothing obvious being hidden, so they're actually comparable. So people would tend to have a little more trust in the official data because they have an independent reality check for that. And that's a lot of what we do, and we think it's very important. So I'll just conclude. We think it's beneficial to have some clear guidelines or some clear language policy from the IAEA as well as other bodies regarding the inclusion of citizen science groups. And we think it's beneficial, certainly from a trust standpoint, but also probably in our current era of social media and mistrust and misinformation, et cetera. It's probably going to be essential. So I will end there and happy to take questions or hear from others.
Catronel, if I may, just for the sake of clarification, I guess that as we made an important point in terms of the position of the IAEA, let me just clarify that for example, the standards of the IAEA, they are a consensus document among the member states that compose the IAEA. So it is also on the side of the member states to bring whatever you just mentioned to the discussions within the IAEA and get that consensus. It's not that the IAEA as an organization has the power to define by itself, without the request of the member state, any position in that regard. So I just want to clarify and to make it clear so that people in the audience can understand the process that we use to produce our standards.
Yes. It's not you people in Vienna sitting on this and stopping it from happening. We understand because we have so much good communication with so many people at the IAEA, so much good support and, again, cooperation, collaboration, and we understand this issue. It requires movement or request or something happening from the member states. So a lot of ducks to line up, and we want to think about what are these ducks, where are they, and how do we line them up? So we're happy to open this up and hear your recommendations as well. But again, I point out 2014, it looked great. The future looked great in this regard. 7 years later, wow, we're still sitting here in the same position. So that, to me, is some aspect of concern.
Thank you very much, Azby, for these inspiring words. I'd like to ask you a question, because as you mentioned, there are lots of recommendations, and one of the latest was indeed in the Engage project, which was recommending authorities and international organizations to engage with citizen science groups. But for this, as well as for citizens' participation in general, we see that, while there are a lot of recommendations, maybe the institutional learning is somehow lagging behind and we are not advancing very much. What do you have an idea why this is? What is your view on this?
Why there's not more citizen participation? Is that the question?
Yeah, why we are still at the level of recommendations, maybe, but not so much at practice?
Well, Japan is such a special case because we had a disaster. and people are motivated, and we personally were motivated, the people who began SAFFECAST and are doing this. We needed questions answered for ourselves and for our families and people that we cared about, and this was a huge motivator. I mean, don't underestimate the potential of disasters to motivate people to do things, and we think of our project as a kind of a positive outcome of disaster. So without disaster, I mean, we have a lot of monitoring done in places, as we said, in Europe, which is simply normal background. People are curious. They have a lot of reasons they want to participate. Some are scientists, most are not. They don't want to know what's happening in their neighborhood. But I think in our case, it was an organic project. It arose from the ground up. And as we speak so many times at RICOMET and other meetings about having official agencies, official bodies or government trying to encourage or promote this, it is, again, difficult. Again, partly this trust issue is there. They're saying, who is this for? Why is it happening? Is it real? Can we trust this organization? And these are very, very real issues. So, but I think with example, and people see the benefits, as we have more examples and more clear results of this, I think more people will want to participate. And if they find out they have an option, a lot of people just don't know that it's possible. So if they find out they have an option, then they will take advantage of it.
Thank you very much. Maybe one small question for you, which is from, just a moment, I don't see it anymore. From Thierry Schneider. He mentions that the ICRP publication 146 introduces the co-expertise approach. This approach is not exactly citizen science, although it could include it. Do you make a difference between contributing to the scientific approach and the joint assessment and management of the situation?
First, thank you, Terry, for the question. Yesterday, you know, we had a great discussion about transdisciplinary approaches. And I think that's what basically we're promoting. And we could make some differentiation between co-expertise, citizen science, between scientific approach and this joint assessment. I am really most interested in joint assessment, in people who are affected, who are stakeholders, really very important stakeholders, participating in both the decision-making and the evaluation of the results. And I think joint assessment and management is very, very crucial. And I know it's not part of our agenda for this particular meeting, but we have an upcoming issue regarding the release of water from Fukushima Daiichi, which will require very, very intensive monitoring, and we think should include as many stakeholders as possible with this joint assessment and management. So I want to promote that as well. But of course, it has to be scientifically valid. We agree. It has to be scientifically valid. The systems need to be fit for purpose. They don't always need to be the highest quality, the most sensitive detectors, et cetera, but they need to be fit for purpose. And a lot of the purpose is, of course, communication and confirmation. So I think the social side of this is always going to loom very, very large, at least as large as the technical scientific side.
Thank you very much. Now we move to our next speaker, Deborah Oughton. Would you like to introduce her first?
Thank you, Katrina. I'm more, just want to say that I'm more optimistic a little bit than Azby Brown. The fact that we are here, Azby, is already an example that some progress has been made in that regards of getting IAEA participating in this overall conversation. Having said that, sorry?
I agree and appreciate it. We all appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Azby. We have Deborah Oughton as our last speaker, and Deborah would explore the ethical dimensions of the process, the vulnerabilities, commitments with the future generations, expenditures to be realized in the present, and prioritization in relation to other social demands. So all very important and crucial points. Deborah is the director of the Center of Environmental Radioactivity at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, an adjunct professor at the University of Oslo, where she teaches research ethics to PhD students. She has worked for nearly 30 years in the social and ethical aspects of radiation risks, and is currently a member of UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology, COMEST, and a member of the All European Academics, ALEA, Permanent Working Group on Science and Ethics. Having said that, Deborah, a great pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Horst. It's a great pleasure to be here, and also to round up this well, not round up the session, but a final comments. And I've been asked to address specifically some of the ethical challenges to do with participatory approaches in decision making. Okay, and basically, as Horst says, there's three main areas I want to look at. I want to look at the ethical justification for why we need participatory approaches in the first place. So why engage with stakeholders? And there's often a focus on the more instrumental aspects of stakeholder engagement, the efficiency that it helps to have decisions accepted. But there are actually some very fundamental ethical reasons behind why we should be engaging with stakeholders and broad members of the public. I mean, there's also legislative grounds, and in the presentations earlier, it was interesting, those were mentioned for reasons for why actually we know we have to, because the law says we have to engage with, participate with stakeholders. And for example, the Aarhus Convention is one, and that's framed in very fundamental ethical values, that the rights to access to information, the right to participate, and the right actually of access to justice. So this is part of what we're saying is this democratization as well, the fundamental right of people and affected people to take part in decisions that affect their life. Of course, there's an empowerment dimension as well. It will promote, control and influence over environment. And based on that discussion we had earlier on perceptions of risk, we know that these aspects, they're ethically relevant, control and consent over risks, are ethically relevant as well as psychologically relevant, and as well as important for perceptions of risk. The ethical dimension of why we need to engage with stakeholders recognizes their right to participate in these decisions. Interestingly, we also had this in the discussion yesterday on multidisciplinary action. So that was raised there as well, this right to participate. But when we're also looking at how to do it, here also ethical dimensions become important, because the way you carry out engagement with stakeholder and participatory processes, or indeed citizen science if you want, also should be evaluated in terms of the quality of the process, both in terms of likelihood of getting success, but also the quality of the process in terms of meeting with ethical values and perspectives. So some typical frameworks here, and I'll just this is a really good paper led by Yevgenia Tomkiv, part of her PhD, on assessing the whole quality of stakeholder engagement. So looking at inclusiveness, meaning that you want to have deliberation not on just on what the authorities want the stakeholders to talk about, but they should also be involved in framing the issues that should be on the table for discussion. Flexibility and continuity and independence. So there should be some genuine impact on the decision. It might not be the case that the stakeholders have the overall responsibility for the eventual decision, but we should be expecting some kind of influence on the decision. And we also have to think quite carefully about how the participants have been selected. So transparency, this comes up in all sort of ethical guidelines for how to carry out procedures. It's not just about how the process is carried out, but also being very, very honest and clear about the purpose, aims and benefits of the process. And accountability. So even if the eventual decision, we had the question earlier on what do you do in lack of consensus, but it's being this accountability to make sure that the concerns of the participants and the stakeholders are addressed and seen to be important, and they're addressed even if the eventual decision is not is going against maybe what certain stakeholders have recommended. So these should be recorded and responded to. So there's a very ethical dimension also to how these procedures are carried out. I was also asked to just say a little bit about the challenges. I mean, there's a basic challenge, and this is if you don't carry out the procedures correctly, they can be seen to be more propaganda. You're just doing it because you're told to do it. You're not really listening to the stakeholders. It's just legitimizing decisions, diffusing opposition, warning agencies of potential political obstacles, and satisfying those procedural legal requirements. That's quite an old quote, but I think it's a quote that still applies, and we still see this in some of the reactions of stakeholders as to what they see as unfair, unjust procedures where they are not being properly represented in the decision-making process. But at the same time, this responsibility issue also needs to be looked at very carefully. And there can be a tendency, because you're saying, well, the stakeholders need to be involved in decisions that are important for their lives, for authorities maybe to use that as reasons to avoid taking on responsibility. And this balance of responsibilities, we're saying we don't want participatory processes where there's no influence on the decision at all. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there is still some authority or some agency or some identifiable agency. And this is the important thing. It should be identifiable at the beginning of the process, who is bearing the overall responsibility and what the influence is of stakeholder approaches. So it's not as an excuse to avoid responsibility. And that quote at the end, I mean, this was related actually specifically to the decision or not for individuals to move back, but I think that's a quote that's recognizes this importance of who has responsibility for the overall decisions. The decisions are those of individuals, fundamental principle of ethics that they need to be respected, but it's not something that should be done in isolation through dialogue and community support. And finally, because I know we are really, really short of time, this issue to do with future generations, with remediation, this needs to recognize that there may be balance of interests, and we need to look at that balance of interest for the present generation and our obligations to future generations in dealing with remediation, because it can be argued on both sides that the future generations should have a part as well in the decision making, so we should leave some choices of this, or it should also be argued that it's our responsibility actually to deal with the situation and not leave problems for future generations. So this is not an easy topic, and it's one that's had a focus in very many different areas of environmental remediation, not just to do with the nuclear industry or norms or radiation. This whole idea about what our obligations are to future generations and how we actually meet those obligations and how we deal with them in the decision-making process. And one thing that's although there's no easy answer, one thing that I think ethically has had a lot of focus is this notion of economic discounting. If you start to discount the value of a life of a future generation compared to existing generations, so that seemed to be a particular problem when on the economic side. And I think also future generations underlines the discussion we've been having on risk. This is very multidimensional. It's only one factor that plays into the discussions of remediation. It's important when it's only one. And as I think Katrinel said, we can have disagreements about technical risks. We can have disagreements about probabilities and still actually agree on what the right thing is to do. Or we can agree on what the technical dimensions of the risk are and still disagree on what to do because of ethical issues to do with this ethical dimension of risk. So I think I'll stop there and see if there are any questions there. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Actually, you also answered to one comment which was posed by Simon Carroll, who was asking whether to frame things around risk, is it not too limiting, and that people wish to engage around things that are important to them, where risk, however this is interpreted, is only one aspect. So what do you think is the role of participation here of different stakeholders, including, for instance, citizen groups, in clarifying this, how the problems are framed and what is being taken into consideration into decision making?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I was saying, risk is one dimension, and there is a tendency, particularly from experts, to talk about this in the technical sense. And we've seen that discussion already. And I think I agree with Abel here that there's also complexities in the technical discussion of risk. So it's not just a case of and it's not just the public that has different perceptions of risk. We all have different factors that impact on whether we think something's acceptable or not. So the question of the size of the risk is just one dimension of the acceptability of risk. So, I mean, that could be one part of what we're discussing with stakeholders to understand different dimensions and understand whether what we are disagreeing about, if we're disagreeing about things. Are we disagreeing about technical issues to do with consequences, or is it more complicated than that? And I can see that Simon and Yevgeny are having an exchange that's saying almost exactly what I'm saying here now. That's not surprising, knowing Simon and Yevgeny. Okay.
Much, Deborah, for clarifying this. Okay, so Horst, over to you for a round of questions for our panelists.
Yeah, I guess that many important issues were raised from the beginning. I just want to push on Abel because he made a very interesting presentation in terms of conjecture versus facts. And in the range of the low doses, I already spoke about inferences. In this book that has been published recently, Legacies of Fukushima, there is a chapter which talks about some interesting points, and there is a sentence that says that the lack of scientific proof of causality is not proof that such causality does not exist. So how to, and I can extend this question to the other panelists if they wish to comment, but starting with Abel, how to cope with that thinking in terms of decision making.
That is correct, Horst. You know, you can disagree with science. I mean, there are many people still in the world that believe that Copernicus was wrong and that the Earth is plane. I mean, this is you can always do that. Now, the real fact is that we cannot prove that there are effects at low doses. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why we cannot do it. But we have a lot of conjectures, and some say that there can be a risk. You know that there are people who say that not only there is not a risk, but this could be good for you. Well, my personal conjecture is that there are sufficient information for presuming a risk. What I wanted to underline is a conjecture, even as solid as could not be confused with a factual scientific conclusion, because this can give you really completely different universe. I mean, remember the damage that has been done not by the Greens or by a person in the street, by the New York Academy of Science. They have published a study saying that in Chernobyl, 1 million people have been killed. I mean, this is a very serious issue, no? I mean, you are sure that 1 million people have been killed? I mean, are you prepared to sign a paper in court accusing somebody who have killed 1 million people? You know, this is similar to the Second World numbers. Well, this is the problem that we face. Frankly speaking, only with radiation we face that problem, because in not any other part of science, decisions are taken on the basis of conjectures. And this has a very important legal implication, because how you can impute for something if we have nobody who can sign that really something has happened. Radiopathologists can sign only in effect if the doses have been high. Epidemiologists can sign about effect if the dose has been the medium term. We know that below 100 millisievert approximately, you have epistemological problems to prove in
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we can also hear some other voices on this. Anybody else from the panel would like to react?
Well, again, I'll just reiterate what others have said. Often people who are in this situation or affected, they want an absolute black or white answer. Is it safe or is it not safe? And we often we won't answer it's safe or not safe. We will say, well, we will help you understand the situation and understand how to make this judgment yourself and help you understand the disagreements or lack of consensus. But still people, it's a very emotional situation. And it's not about the numbers. It's about their situation and their need for some reassurance and sense of agency and being in control. So I remember early after the accident, I was arguing with a close colleague at the time about the risks to thyroid, et cetera. And she was certain that, a million kids would die in Fukushima. And I said, that probably is not the case. Really, it's probably not the case. The data is not showing that. And she said, can you guarantee me that not even one child will die from thyroid cancer? And I said, no, of course not. And for her, that was it. She wanted to know that not a single person would die. And this is the reality of people's perception. And we can discuss risk and, inference and all these things. Hopefully we can help people understand, but it doesn't change the emotional response. And that's what we're dealing with.
But it's peculiar that this is happening only in our profession. Nobody, for instance, question whether people will die of the contamination that there is in the normal tap water that we are taking. I mean, the authorities say this tap water is safe and everybody drink the tap water. Therefore, we have created a system that allows this. And frankly speaking, I believe that it's criminal what we have done in that respect, because we have created a lot of harm, People have been seriously harmed by this approach that we have been taken. In Japan in particular, there has been even people who commit suicide in Japan because of this. Therefore, I believe that some mea culpa in our profession it will be convenient.
Jan Haverkamp made a comment that the word safe is maybe the tricky word to use, and he would argue that it is indeed better to exclude this from discussions where risk is involved. Well, I'd like to ask Christine, because your organization has a lot of experience in stakeholder participation. How did you, build, what is your experience? How do you build mutual trust between stakeholders, and how did the organization decide to move from this, decide, announce, defend towards more participatory approaches?
So it was a journey, Katrinel, and it's a journey that we continue on. So I think in the 2 case studies I put up, Rocky Flats and Fernald, we had a very clear set of objectives, and we had a defined process where we had stakeholders who wanted to participate and were going to participate through the life of the decisions and the life of the project, with active cleanup being accomplished. And I noted that there was a question about how do you deal with the fact that the folks who tend to be engaged are just those who want to participate, and how do you reach out to those who maybe don't have an interest in your site? And that's a real challenge for the sites that remain in the DOE environmental management program now, because the site at Hanford in Washington, for instance, has decades of cleanup to do. So finding a mechanism that keeps all of the affected stakeholders meaningfully engaged for such a long process around such complex cleanup decisions, like what you do with tanks and how you close them, and how safe will they be 1,000 years from now? Is 1,000 years the right period, or 10,000 years? And how do we wrap our head around 10,000 years when the country's only been in existence, in our modern governance for less than 300, right? I mean, it raises all kinds of questions of reliability in our decisions. And so I think, to go back to the question of how do you cope with that kind of uncertainty in decision making, for us, it's through iteration of models and letting them understand, what uncertainty means around certain calculations and what it means in terms of consequence, and letting them have a voice into the exposure scenarios that are being modeled. Even if those exposure scenarios are more conservative than the regulations would require, just doing that as a mechanism for letting them see the difference, the different impacts or the different consequences of various decisions that we might make. And then, it's just proving that you're hearing them and that they can see how their input was considered. It's getting to some of the points that Deborah mentioned, accountability, being accountable and responding to. So it's not just getting their input, it's actually engaging them and letting them know what you did with their input. So dispositioning their comments, explaining to them why we didn't take their advice, or why we couldn't reach consensus, or why we ended up with a different exposure scenario than what they wanted us to model. I mean, it's that you just have to do it through continuous dialogue and effort. It takes time, commitment, and financial resources. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christine. Stéphane, what is your experience as a regulator with this very complex issue?
Yes, very complex indeed. But my reflection is that we focus many of our attentions on the risk, but in my experience, the concern of the people is not always the risk. Many times people raise other concern than the risk, and they raise concern about the value of their property, for instance. They raise concerns about, I don't know, the trucks which are passing by because of the remediation works. So I think you really need to, you should be careful not focusing all your attentions on the issue of risk or risk perceptions. Sometimes the risk perceptions will be very different depending on the interest of the people you are talking with. So don't, well, just my reflections, don't focus all your attentions on the issue of risk, but also on other factors.
But for now, why we have Stéphane on the spot, one of the things that you mentioned, Stéphane, from the beginning of your presentation was the idea of relevant authority, and then you mentioned that there might be many authorities involved in the decision-making process, and even in our previous conversation, you referred to the fact that even in the same regulatory authority, you might have different levels of decision. And then you brought the concept of leadership. So is this a matter of policy, or how do you can build that concept of leadership when you have that wide range of decision makers?
So I have no ready-made answer to your question. I think, well, we come back to the question of trust. To have a good leadership, you need to trust each other. And to trust you, I mean, you need to trust your leader, otherwise you will, you will never follow him. I think what you need is to understand the role of each authority or partners in the decision-making process, and to define clearly the boundary of your decision, and to define clearly the decision-making process, to avoid that, yeah, you know, that you are just one agency is just waiting for the decision of another agency and the other way around. So I think it's really a mutual understanding you need to build step by step, and beginning at the low level. I mean, you don't need, I mean, you should avoid to waiting for your manager decisions. Just pick up your phone and discuss with your colleague of the other authorities, and well, just discuss what are the problems or what are the issues, and then okay, if there are things that you cannot solve yourself, then ask your manager. But you see, sometimes you need also to be informed in the way you work.
So, Katrina, before you wrap up, I have one last issue to raise, essentially to Azby and to Deborah. They could both talk about it. We talk about trust. I think trust is permeating our conversation. But Azby mentioned, if I understood him well, that citizens' initiatives, maybe like SAFFECAST, should keep a prudent distance from official organizations because that could compromise their credibility. So with that in mind, I understand that the official organizations are prone to be distrust anyhow, because this is a kind of approximation would contaminate the credibility of citizen initiative. Did I understand well? And if it is, understanding is correct, how can you cope a participatory process with that situation already put on the outset? We can start with Azby, maybe.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll point out that this, stress on the need for independence of organizations like, Citizen Science or SAFFECAST, that was the language from IEM 6. That was from the draft report of that meeting. So we would agree, but that was actually from them. Yes, it's about actual independence and the perception of independence. And again, because of this mistrust in government at all levels, and it's really a fairly global phenomenon, and also official bodies, there is a risk that someone like SAFFECAST, if they're perceived as being too close with a body like IAEA or some others, that we're not really independent, we're not keeping the best interest of the people in mind as much as perhaps supporting another agenda. And this is, even if it's totally mistaken, it's still a very common perception. So we are happy to collaborate with anybody and work with anybody. We do not take funding from government, for instance, for this reason. And we're very cautious about funding from other sources for this reason. But we think that, dialogue is important and collaboration is always going to be important. And it can be done from a, let's say, respectful distance, maintaining independence. We believe it can be done. We think we've been doing that for 10 years.
Thank you. Deborah?
Yes, I underline everything that Azby said, but I think there's two dimensions to the trust issue with remediation. The first is, for the authorities, they will get trust by opening up to the participatory decision processes, by saying that this needs to be done. That's maybe just one first initial step in actually building trust with stakeholders. Sometimes it is important for the people in charge to take a step back and to promote some real independence in the process, that they're going to have to hand over control, even if it's not handing over control to the eventual decision making, but handing over control to the participatory process to somebody else who's seen to be independent in terms of framing and running the process. And then this idea of independence in monitoring is also something that very, very often comes up in remediation. So that's some way of the authorities showing trust that, yes, the participants can engage their own monitoring procedures to support trust for the process in itself. So being able to do independent monitoring is seen as very, very central to trust. But the first step along trust is earning that trust, and recognizing that these procedures are necessary is maybe just one small step.
Back to you, Katrinel.
Okay, thank you, Horst. So I think we had lively discussions, which was not void of controversies, which are decades old. In general, most of the speakers recognize the importance of involving multiple disciplines and also multiple voices in decision making. And we see that there is a willingness from international institutions, but also some national actors. And we've had very nice examples also in this webinar. So there are examples where really there are steps being made towards more inclusion and having all voices heard in decision making. We should, however, not forget that stakeholder engagement is also about redistribution of power in society. And I think that there is still a lot of work to be done. Some discussions, it seems they never age. We are sometimes going in cycles. Important is to maintain the dialogue and mutual respect between participants in the dialogue, and continue to promote institutional learning in that respect. This is my take. First, if you want to say something, otherwise we will thank all participants to the webinar. Would you like to say something? Or?
No, I think that you summarized pretty well.
Okay.
I just want to.
Yes, please.
No, I just want to thank our panelists for the participation and the attendees and the many comments and questions. I think we can capture all of them, and then we can reflect on how to address those ideas and the work we are doing. To all of you, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.